can now listen to full-length, commercial-free episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast on Patreon. Please sign up at patreon.com/Janice Selby or click the link in the show notes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Pesach Eisen is a New York-based psychotherapist, researcher, and artist. He was raised in an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jewish faith community from which he gradually departed during his 20s. Pesach explores the intersection of religious disaffiliation and mental health, and is passionate about helping improve the quality of life of religious trauma survivors and those who exit religions. Pesach spoke at the inaugural conference on religious trauma in 2021, and I'm delighted that he'll be joining us again at Court 2023. Welcome, Pesach.
Hello, Janice. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and, very nice to see you again.
Same. It's been a while. And congrats on all the amazing things you're doing. With court and shame and sexuality. So wonderful.
It really is. I just never imagined my life taking me in this direction. And I bet you never imagined your life taking you in the direction you've gone in.
You can say that again. Yeah, it's something about, we're going to have a conversation about what led up to here. And it's in a sense only possible to have that in any coherent sense in hindsight. While it's happening, it doesn't sound like this. And I find that important to name, because people listen to this and they're like, how come I don't feel this? How come it doesn't narrate like that for me? Well, first of all, this is the less messy version. And second of all, it's in hindsight. We can restructure the situation, but as we're going through, it doesn't sound or feel like this, at least for me.
That's so true. I mean, some famous person said life has to be lived forward, but it's only understood backwards. And that certainly seems to make sense for those of us who have come through religious trauma. And I'm sure people would love to hear some about your background, because it's very... it's just so intriguing, the whole idea of Hasidic Orthodox Judaism. Most of us don't really ever get a peek into that world. You lived it. It was a very important part of your life. And now you find yourself on the other side. So please tell us a little bit about what it was like, not only growing up in it, but what actually led to your transition.
Of course. I bet if somebody went through all my interviews, and compared what I'm about to say, it wouldn't be word for word. I find that our stories morph, and they're not like a textbook. Yeah. So I grew up in New York City. And I start with that because the setting is in New York City, one of the most, the melting pot of the world. Super secular, at least in packaging. Everybody knows New York City. So you grew up in New York City. Okay. Now let me tell you the more important part of the story. And whenever I think about it, I find it so wild that I grew up in a completely different microcosm that was nested in one of the most modern metropolitan areas of the world. I'm still mind blown by how that fits or works. Yeah. So I grew up in in New York City, which has 5 boroughs. There's New York State. New York State is big. And then there's New York City. And New York City has 5 boroughs. One of the boroughs is called Brooklyn. And I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And in Brooklyn, I guess I would call Brooklyn the Torah Belt instead of the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
Because there are many neighborhoods in there. And if you look at the map, it kind of maps out like a belt. And I grew up in a neighborhood called Borough Park, which is mostly Hasidic at this point. Between 100,000 and 200,000 Hasidim live in that town. Yeah. And how do I arrange this? Okay, so Judaism. Everybody knows Judaism. It's the OG of Abrahamic religions. And it's a very ever-evolving religion. It's never been one thing, despite the people who I grew up with and what they say. And I grew up in the iteration of it that took place in America decades after World War II. So I'm just putting it in context because all of these things played a role in the fundamentalism that I grew up in. So Judaism is huge. It's a people. It's a ethno-religion. It's a bunch of other words that I don't exactly know what they mean yet. But it's not either a religion, sort of like Christianity, which you can unplug from and be like, I am not religious anymore. Ex-Christian. Right. Very, very few people, although it's valid how they identify as ex-Jewish. Right. It's really not that common. Why? I'm still working through it. But the starting point is that it's ethno-religion. It's a very complicated phenomenon. So Judaism is huge, and only 10%, as far as we know, according to research, is what we call Orthodox Jewish, right? So 90% of the Jewish people are anywhere beyond that spectrum, from religious light all the way to secular humanist or ex-Jewish. Only 10% are Orthodox. Now, Orthodoxy is also a massive spectrum. If you have to go all the way to the right to get to the Ultra-Orthodox, and not everybody likes that term. I'm using it just for conversational purposes. Okay. The Hebrew word is Haredi Judaism, and they are maybe 2% of that 10%.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So it's a sub category, but for a lot of people, maybe in the hundreds, thousands, or millions if you combine Israel as well.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm going into the boring stats, but it's important to paint this picture, I think. When people think of Jewish people, they think of that sort of archetype, that visibly Jewish person.
That's right.
But most Jewish people are Jews in their heart, or however you want to call it. They belong to a people, but they are not Orthodox or observed. Yeah. People are surprised when I say this, but it is the truth. Hasidic Judaism or Haredi Judaism more broadly. Okay, I'm all over the place. Let me organize it first. So most Jews aren't Orthodox. 10% are. A very small percentage of that is what I call Ultra-Orthodox. The rest are plain Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Reform, conservative, and so on and so forth. Now, Ultra-Orthodox / Haredi has also a few categories, and one of them is Hasidic. Yes. And that's the one I grew up in. Hasidic Judaism is a very specific subcategory of Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and they're marked by maybe a bit of a niche type of packaging of rules, and the look, and many other things that differentiate them from other Ultra-Orthodox. But they do fall under the umbrella, under the Venn diagram overlaps a lot with other Ultra-Orthodox sects. It originated in, I think, in its full form in like the 19th century in Europe as a reaction a little bit to what then emerged as more modern phenomena of Judaism, the Enlightenment, Reform, conservative Judaism. So some people were not happy about that. And I grew up with them being admired for having done this. And they are sort of a reactionary, doubling down on the situation. Yeah. Sadly and tragically, most of the Hasidic or Haredi Jews were decimated. They were almost wiped out completely during the Holocaust. So it's kind of wild, and they ascribe supernatural reasons for this, that they rebuilt, right? They say we are the truth because look at us now, and we are in the millions. You and I probably have different interpretations of why that happened, but it's wild to think that it's not that old. It's just as much a modern phenomenon as the Enlightenment. And these are all messages that I learned later. And they're almost decimated, and now it's flourishing. There is this sort of guesstimate that by 2050, most Jews, because of the high birth rate, and we don't know what the portrait of Judaism will look like. but it's changing drastically. Yeah, people are trying to wrap their heads around that. So I grew up in a Hasidic community after the Holocaust, right? In this sort of peoplehood that's rebuilding. They're reacting to a major trauma. They're trying to recreate sort of the European shtetl feeling. They're like, what is shtetl is like village, but not quite.
Okay.
It's a very specific word for like small towns that Hasidim used to live in.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're trying to sort of be frozen in time, right? The outfits and because in a sense, maybe, one of the reasons is they perceive that the Holocaust may have been a punishment for what the other Jews are doing. So there's many different forces. None of this is simple or reductive. And they're rebuilding and over time getting more and more strict. And I am born into this thing in 1985 when it's pretty much established in Borough Park, which is in Brooklyn. And I grew up in New York, but my entire existence is very different from New York. It's super insulated. So I'm not supposed to step outside of the neighborhood. I'm not supposed to, explore literature, media outside of the system. So maybe I am nested in New York, but what I call phenomenal world is a different universe entirely. And
did you have TV? Did you have access to anything?
No.
Wow. So you might see, occasionally you might see a non-Jewish person in the neighborhood, but it would be really unusual.
Not that unusual.
Okay.
Because it's not like, the Berlin Wall.
Right.
Right. There's still, moving in and out, the workers and businesses, they clean our houses. So they're around us, but we know of them and of those things that you mentioned earlier, like the TV, as things that we're not supposed to do. Right. So they're in our consciousness, but as negatives.
Yes.
Don't. Right. Not ignorance, just prohibition. We could probably talk about this for days, and this doesn't do it justice. But it was very insulated, not only physically, but psychologically. Fundamentalist, right? There's one way, and we have it. Everybody else who colors outside of it is, either evil or off the deep end, even Jews, right?
Right.
They're sort of, we hope that they'll eventually come back to this magnetic force because they've deviated. Right. Not only non-Jewish folks.
So does this mean people cannot convert into Ultra-Orthodox Hasidic? You have to be born into it.
Maybe it's worth zooming out. Judaism doesn't walk around inviting people into its peoplehood. It has a sort of more protective wall around it, but it doesn't prohibit. There is this ethno-religion in Israel that are called, I think, the Drusim. They have this thing. They just, no exits, no entries.
Wow.
But we don't have that.
Okay.
We do treat it a little bit like a religion in that sense. You can converge to it.
Okay,
it's very confusing. A lot of contradictions. Yeah. But it's not straightforward. You really have to mean it. You have to ask multiple times. There's a whole system in place because we are very protective. People have tried to hurt us for thousands of years. This is in our blood, in our psychology. And I'm not going to compare it to other oppressions of minoritized people, but something like that, right? So it's hard to get it. And according to the more religious people, impossible to get out of.
Yeah.
And some ex-Jewish folks, I think, I'm not going to speak for them, but they're sort of reclaiming that story. I can opt out if I want to.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Authoritarian. And one of its main features was absolute control. The because I said so. The because I'm not going to say it again.
Wow.
The because you don't talk back to me. Who are you to ask questions? So sort of very hierarchical, appeal to authority is its bread and butter. Very structured. Not only behaviorally, but psychologically, emotionally. This is what you think, feel, sense, and do throughout the entire day. Very regimented. Very hijacked by a lot of things. You don't have a lot of energy elsewhere. And highly demanding. Very easy to fail at and be imperfect and do it like this, but it's impossible.
Wow.
Yeah. And tightly bound relational. We don't talk to others. A bit like an organism that's sleeping with one eye open. We're unsafe. Stay alert. Here we are. There they are. And these are so far just the darker elements of it. that was not all of it.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah. For me personally, it was. And if you look at reality, maybe not for others, but it was every aspect of life is prescribed. From the second you open your eyes in the morning, you dive right in before you even step off the bed to say a prayer and wash your hands, and the same when you go to sleep, right? So this thing is wrapped around and owns you. Yeah. What else is worth before we move forward? So life is governed by rules about everything. What you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're saying, how you're behaving, when you do what you eat, how you eat it. What are you allowed to eat together and what aren't you? You can go ad infinitum. Hundreds or thousands. And as I'm describing it, as a psychotherapist, you can probably imagine what it has the possibility of doing to a developing human being. And it maybe doesn't do it for all of them. I'm not going to speak for others. But I'm just going to very generalizedly say that it just doesn't sound okay. But maybe that's from my narrow perspective and personal experience. Yeah, you don't have access to anything. And this is more like a textbook explanation, right? When you go on the ground, people do all kinds of things. They probably color outside the lines, probably lie and hide, and sin and whatnot. But this is sort of on the books, the packaging. Yeah. And I can go on and on. And I'm just going to wrap it up with that our primary language wasn't even English. So to wrap this all up, you're living in a world where the peoplehood you belong to have created a different world that is nested in it, that doesn't do anything that the rest of the world that you're looking at is doing, including your meaning making and the language that you're using.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. And so did you have siblings? Do you have siblings?
I do. I'm one of 6, which is actually considered quite small. Many families have double or more. And I'm the second to the youngest. Yeah. I have 1 brother and 4 sisters. And I can get into that deeper, maybe not today, but I think it helped me a little bit on being surrounded by women. Maybe cushioned the blow a little bit and made me into a mensch, as they say. Yeah. But yeah.
So at what point did you start thinking there was more to life than what you were living, or you just felt so confined you didn't feel like you could stay living like that anymore? How did you end up on the other side?
Big question. Messy answers. For me, it's never been neat, this story, because it would not reflect the truth. I think that the first few years of it was more of it being swept up rather than mindfully choosing or deciding. I was sort of coping, maybe surviving. So when I look back, I always asked them, I was always had a little bit of tension with the thing. Could be probably not because of its ideology, because, I didn't have that kind of questions when I was 4. Maybe more socio-emotionally. Something felt off. Like, this is too much. I can't do it right. Am I bad? How come everybody seems okay? I don't. In my private world, a lot of that stuff. I was more of a inward-facing kid, shy, reserved, and with like infinitely inward, wondering what's going on here. Something's off. Yeah, and this was most of my childhood, but I managed. I went to school every day. I also had fun. It sort of worked, and I was, I guess, hoping and fantasizing that one day it'll click. That it won't have this like itch, this like existential itch. It never happened, but I gave it a real fair shot. I promised myself that by the time my bar mitzvah comes around, which is when you're 13, a Judaic adult, I'm going to give this full attention it deserves, because now I'm getting judged like an adult. In God's eyes, children have a bit more leniency. So I went full force, like, what's the term? Religious scrupulosity? Yeah, I took it on like that. Some sort of combination of the fawn, like, I got to make this work, otherwise things are going to go really bad socially eventually. And also because it's the right thing to do. But that sort of thing does not stick together. At least it didn't for me. And my adolescence was sort of riddled with this roller coaster ride. This inner war between good and evil is the only framing I had for it at the time. Wow. We
That's
have
so
terms
heavy.
for it. It is. I'm really sad for my younger self when I say it out loud. We have these words. It's called Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov. It's almost like two forces or angels inside of you. One is on one shoulder, the other one is on that one, and they're fucking with you. One wants you to do X, the other one wants you to do Y. And I don't think that is the healthiest internal self-organization. It fragments you, is what I experienced. Fragmentation, with long seasons of immobility, because I can't. That tug of war is exhausting. Type feeling. So for me, it started out as really maybe not intellectual, like more like a basic emotional social needs. Something's off, trying to make it work. It's not. Something must be broken with me. What's wrong with me is the dominant question. I'm also doing things I'm not supposed to and feeling really bad about it. And a teenager filled with this stuff, which later on I'm going to have to work through. But the damage is being laid down full force. Eventually, I think when I look back at the organism that was me, it found a way to get the hell out. It convinced my parents to allow me to study abroad as a teen.
Wow.
Yeah. Because Baba has branches all over the world. And there is a very famous, quote unquote, good yeshiva in Israel. And that was sort of the strategy, not knowingly, because home was super intense and maybe played a big role in all of it. A very strict home. But I went to Israel when I was 14 and a half.
Wow, that is so young to go to another country by yourself.
I wasn't totally by myself. It was sort of like a group of kids.
Okay.
So it was like a peer group.
Yeah.
But still, I'm still wondering why my parents ever agreed. That wasn't like them. But maybe they smelled something was off about me, and they wanted to, give it, let's give this to him. Let's see if this is going to work.
Yeah.
And I tried again. I was tussling with this thing over there, but here I am having some sort of freedom that I couldn't describe in words. Right? It's hard to resist that being swept up in the other things.
Yeah.
I don't have to be afraid that anybody's going to scold me, maybe hit me or threaten me. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's one phone call every Friday to wish them good Shabbos,
So you weren't living with another equally Hasidic ultra-Orthodox family there, or were you? And it's just that it was not your family.
Yeah. It was equally or more strict.
Wow.
It was almost like there's a lot of advocates nowadays and people who talk about those special schools or something that are abusive and strict. And maybe it was on that spectrum, like a boot camp.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, these forces were still at play, but it wasn't the immediate nucleus of a family.
Okay.
And I was with people all day at night, and I guess had more permission, or less afraid. And over time, eventually, I was not let back, because the second existence introduced a little bit of freedom and exposure. That a part of me started diving in, and it started taking over more of me. And eventually, after 3 years, he would come home every half year between semesters. And I'm in New York, ready to go back the 4th year because it's a 4-year program. And the guy calls my parents, and they're like, "This guy ain't coming back."
Wow.
I was off the deep end already, like going where I wasn't supposed to go, sleeping in, and violating a bunch of things, and being a bad influence. Is the term.
So so you were about 17 or 18, going on 18 at this time?
Yeah, almost 18. Don't know what the heck's going on. Very disoriented, but ready to go back. One day at a time. But this monkey wrench is thrown in, and a new thing starts. Yeah. And then it was chaos for a few years. They didn't know what to do with me. I didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah.
It was like a liminal space. Tried this, tried the other, tried marrying me off, which is a major strategy, because that's just a rite of passage, and with the hope that will sort of domesticate you. Nobody wants me because I have a bad reputation. Really hurts at the time. In hindsight, a miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I say that very sensitively, because not everybody has it work out like that. And it's so much harder later. But I'm allowed to celebrate that within myself, that I evaded something that would have maybe made it very, very bad. Eventually, I do something that you're not supposed to do, which is enter the workforce before you get married.
Wow.
Because, it's musical chairs. This chair not working. This one not working. Eventually, okay. I enter the workforce, and this thing happens very gradually and messy. There's still the evil, between the evil and good inside of me. One day I'll make it work. But I'm so far off already. Yeah. And
were you still living at home?
Yeah. Still living at home. Still basically fully belong, but violating within the paradigm. Thinking that some magic would happen eventually. A U-turn. And eventually, as I'm still living at home, I am not religious at all anymore.
Wow.
I don't look the part. I'm basically this person, but I haven't left this sort of environmental cocktail. Yeah, and it's not pretty. It's when you're in it, you're bumping your head against the wall. Of people having issues with it, threatening you, making you feel bad. And it becomes more and more unhealthy for me. And in my early 20s is when I physically left. It wasn't planned. Just like most things up until that point, I was swept up in rather than deliberate. A friend called me and said a bedroom just became available, and it just made sense for that domino piece to fall.
Was that person outside the community or still in the community, but just it would give you some space from your parents in your family?
I think at that point I was friends with sort of people like me, on the periphery, still in, but not quite out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's when I physically left, a few blocks outside of the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's like a magnet. There's something they do to us, and it's been happening for 3,000 years. It's physically really hard to move away from it. I don't think there's a term for it, but it takes so long to chip away. It's not linear. You go back, you move away, you start this again, you stop this again. It's super messy. Maybe there are other groups who have this, but for Jewish folks, based on what I said earlier about our history and the ethno-religious stuff, there's something extra there that makes it extra weird and complex.
Yeah.
To cut, to create that cut, that thread there. Yeah. And eventually, from like till about my mid to late 20s, I really was unwell. I was swept up in this thing and feeling horrible about it.
So is that you couldn't even really enjoy the incremental steps you were taking away because you were still just feeling guilty or sad or confused or.
Yeah. I did enjoy some, many of the things, but they were all nested. I don't know what the word is, but I wasn't okay, probably complexly traumatized. So like depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidality, instability, and like not being myself. Yeah. The thing that pivoted the whole thing, not neatly again, was finding a new type of people on the periphery, people who have started to build more intentionally, instead of being sort of the at-risk kids.
Right.
Yeah. And it happened through social media, finding some Facebook groups and some books, some memoirs, and also the organization Footsteps.
Yes.
I think that what held me back until that point was not having proof of concept. My inner world did not have a way of organizing another way. I just had this one narrative that this is what it looks like to leave. You're a mess, a drug addict, you're gonna kill yourself. Really like horrible narratives. Just like inner demons up the wazoo. But now I'm like, and it took time, and it's still taking time. But that opened up new possibilities. Yeah.
Wow. So Footsteps was really instrumental.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And now you're affiliated with them in a professional way.
Yes. So for those who don't know, please excuse me, it's Friday, I'm a bit scattered. Footsteps is the only organization in North America. I think there used to be one in Canada. It was called Forward in Montreal.
Okay.
I think.
Yes.
But I'm not sure if it exists. So Footsteps is the only organization in North America that, like Journey Free, or like Divorcing Religion, helps folks that come from Orthodox Jewish communities, who have left, are in the process of leaving, or want to leave, or change, with sort of wraparound services of anything you can imagine may come up, whether it's mental and emotional support, therapy, individual groups and such, whether it's financial and vocational jobs, employment, whether it's education, whether it's social and communal. There are many different layers and a buffet of services for people who are going through this thing, Yeah. And when I joined them, I joined them with the sole intention of getting a GED, which is a high school diploma.
Yes.
I was like, well, what am I doing next with my life? Here's this place, Footsteps. They offer help for getting the GED. Okay. Eventually it turned, into much bigger than that. But that's why I joined. And they're probably majorly instrumental to my education specifically. Helped me study for my high school diploma. And people at the space like me were also studying for it. And things started to build, scholarships, and so much more, celebrating the wins with the community, because, you can't do that to people that you left behind. So almost like a second family, that doesn't ever quite replace it. But if, this new protective factor, came along and, changed my entire internal organization, how I felt and thought about myself, part of the story. And eventually, I decided that there's this big hole of therapists who maybe have this sort of instinctual understanding of this thing. And why not dive right in there? So I pursued that type of education. And when time came along to do internships, externships and such, I knew right away. And here we are. A few months ago, I actually took a sabbatical, so I'm not there right now, but I am very plugged into the ex-Orthodox Jewish community, as a person, as a therapist, and as a human being.
So your story is so inspiring to me. I can really feel the emotion when you're talking about feeling fragmented and confused, and the battles that were going on internally, in really just wanting to be a good child to your parents, obedient, not to cause trouble, and then still that struggle to be our authentic self and break free and figure out who are we. Were you able to salvage any of the family relationships?
I think so, is the short answer. It's been taken, it's taken on many different forms over the years. It hasn't really moved through. I pendulate in and out of most of things. I think that religious trauma recovery is lifelong. I only speak for myself. I admire and I'm happy for people who it works out for differently,
right?
But not for me. And depending on the different forces in my life and what's going on for me and where I'm at, in my well-being and such, I would work on different things, back off again, come back to it, and still putting the pieces together, and maybe will forever. But I think that the door is open. It's workable to some extent. There's a lot of grief work to do that it's workable in the way I don't want it to be. There's a lot of grief about what I wished it to be, or what I wish they would be like and such, that I'm still not completely over, right? So there's a lot of moving parts over here, but there's no sort of cutting off. They think they pretend I'm dead. There are people who have it really, really, really horrible. That doesn't take away from my struggles, but there could be so much more worse. For me, I'm moving around it very cautiously because it's probably my biggest trigger. But the door's open, and I'm hoping as I get stronger, I can work on things more and maybe create some sort of stable relationship of some sort, or try and see how it goes.
So at this point, you're the only sibling who has stepped away from the religion.
As far as I know, I'm going to share something wild. I actually believe that most ex-Orthodox Jews are only that internally. I think that most of them don't do anything about it. The people who leave may be a minority of heretics, like in many other communities, So maybe I'm not the only one. But as far as I can tell, yeah.
Wow, it's just so interesting. Can you talk to me a little bit about your art? What role has art played for you? And is that art like with a paintbrush, or art as in acting or dancing, or what sort of medium, and how has that been helpful for you?
Great question. You know, one thing I wrote down when you're like, what was the hardest thing to divorcing religion? You know, many of the things that we know about, but the hardest thing about divorcing Orthodox Jewish religion was this sort of breaking the chain narrative. I know many other faiths have it, but we have it in the DNA. It's you're like betraying your peoplehood. You're helping the Nazis. Really bad ways of packaging it. You know, different forces that, like sociocultural forces that make sure that things stay. So that was probably the hardest, to not feel guilty for betraying people at every level. My immediate family, community, the peoplehood was very, very hard to unhook from. Yeah. It could take decades or a lifetime. Yeah. So art. I think I grapple with that word a lot, but I think of art as something bigger than the things that we think about. I think of E.E. Cummings, who says that the artist is no other than he who unlearns what he has learned in order to know himself. So like getting in touch with your more real self, you know, that inside out you rather than the externally dictated you. When I look back, the part of me that enjoyed that life, that felt alive from time to time, was the artist, the kid who was in the play, the kid who was in the choir, the kid that was allowed to do more spontaneous, organic things. Yeah. So in that sense, it helped me reconnect with inner parts that were hijacked by the religion, that were told that they can't develop, and that those things aren't that important, and that, you know, a good Jewish boy focuses on other things, and so on and so forth. That my value system was hijacked. What's important to this organism? So in that sense, I refer to myself as an artist, because I do many different forms of art, but in more existential light. The artist is more operating from an inside out place rather than from an externally dictated place, like a self-trust of some sort. Yeah. I am like a Z-list. I don't know how they organize it in Canada in terms of A-list actors or such. Do they have those terms? Brad Pitt I'm like a Z-list. But I don't really care about that. I care. But I care more about how it makes me feel. So I you know, like indie films, karaoke, been in choirs outside in the secular world. So like the part of me that's not analytical, and intellectual, and, you know, busy with like order, is what I think is super important in religious trauma recovery. Getting back in touch to some extent with a part of you that knows, like an inner knowing of things, and that's your artist. Yeah.
Wow, it just reminds me of so Dr. Marlene Winnell, whom we both know as a pioneer in the field of religious trauma and recovery. And Dr. Winnell talks a lot about inner child work. And it sounds like that's some of what you are referring to, just that child in you who longed to have some freedom, to not be stifled and stuck with the order of all the things you had to do and say and think and remember, where you could just have some freedom there. And that's what it sounds like you're talking about.
Yeah. Before that meta consciousness develops, that analyzes, scolds, judges, you're just being like a spontaneous child. It's hard to tap into sometimes because it didn't quite develop. but there is tiny glimpses of it. I can find a shred of it and hook onto it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's that part of you that just trusts the living.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't always live into, it has to think it out in advance, that hypervigilance,
Mm-hmm.
that premeditation of things is the thing that's been very rewarding to rehabilitate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it hard to do sometimes to embrace that freedom and give yourself permission to do these things? Oh, good, it's not just me, because I struggle with it too.
Yeah, on a daily basis. I would say that I say these things on the extreme end of things, that it's like what we did is almost like learning a new language in very simple terms. What I'm saying is that you cannot lose your mother tongue. The original conditioning and programming is kind of sort of there. But you have learned a new language that you use every day. Like English is not my first language,
right.
but Yiddish is still there.
Yeah.
It's sort of similar. I don't think we resolve or move on from things or delete them like that. I think we build beautiful things around them, next to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the effort that was put in to develop you into this, the same kind of effort or intention has to be put in to be something different. So if they reminded you every day of all the ideas that hurt you or didn't work for you, you kind of have to remind yourself every day of all the things that do. And it's not sort of like, here's my list of the new person I am. It has to be enacted, maybe every day, right? Going to the gym for 1 month and then never again. You know what happens. So it's like a way of being that has to be practiced, maybe with a similar intention than the one that you're programmed with, to give you a fighting chance. I'm not thrilled about that either.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I have found, so occasionally around here we'll have in a pub something called wine and paint night. And so we're all going to go there. We're going to have a few drinks. And there's an artist has a painting that they've done up at the front. And everybody, while they're drinking, is going to be following the artist's instructions to try and come out with a painting that's going to look something like what the artist has actually done. And so my propensity as a consummate rule follower, because that was my safety when I was growing up in a volatile environment. I had to learn the rules and then I could be safe. So I'm sitting at wine and paint night and I'm trying so hard to do an exact replica of what the artist has done. And I will force myself, if I'm doing the moon, maybe instead of doing the moon yellow, I'm going to do it red. I'm going to do it purple. I'm going to draw a little alien stick person on the moon, something that is uncomfortable for me, but that it's me. I can congratulate myself for not having to follow the rules so closely. So I know a lot of people who cross-stitch, and they used to be cross-stitching scripture, and now they make cross-stitch a very naughty word or something that they just would not have done before, but it's the same idea. I now give myself permission to live outside the lines that were dictated, where my parents and my religious group said I had to be a certain way. Frankly, I don't have to be that way, but it does feel like it's a lifelong journey of unlearning that's taking place there.
Wow. That's beautiful, Janice, and I resonate with that a lot. It's what is freedom? I'm not sure, but it feels like the voice of me that has permission to deviate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of I have a conference coming up in October called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. And that sexual freedom, sexual expression, identity, all those things, they were in such a narrow form for us being told what was acceptable. How was it for you being able to move beyond those things? Did you find it super difficult, or?
I want you to tell people more about that conference in a minute. I think that it's going to be really, really helpful to start a conversation around this. We don't talk about this enough, right? We're still nested in a humanity that's very Puritan. We're so afraid of ourselves. You asked when I got beyond that. Not quite, but similar to the other things, work in progress. And also one of the most challenging things was to come back into my body and trust and be at one with my thoughts, feelings, and sensations instead of them being monitored and controlled. Taking ownership of the inside of my own head and heart. I remember during adolescence, it must be one of the most tortured times to grow up in a fundamentalist environment. It's, we know from developmental psychology what happens during adolescence, and it played a big role in the internal shame and guilt. Masturbation, having thoughts, looking, being turned on, all of that stuff. And it's not something that you can control. It's like a sneeze and a fart.
Being human, exactly.
Yeah. Imagine you're beating the crap out of yourself from sneezing. It's really like that. And eventually you're sort of at war with your physicalhood. So it was like that. This was a subcategory in the big tug of war between good and evil. And this is one of the most rewarding things to have recovered from a little bit, not being at war with my body. I remember the first few years that, there are many other things in the religion that you can sort of put on the back burner if you have struggles with. Okay, you know what? I won't smoke anymore. You know what? I won't go to the movies anymore. This is bad. But internal phenomena can't be navigated like that. It just doesn't ask you for permission. I remember when I first left to paint a picture, we grew up, with strict sex/gender segregation. I barely touched my own siblings. So being able to look someone in the eyes and have a conversation on a date, knowing what to say, acting naturally in a hug, things that people take for granted, felt very, very awkward, navigating. I had some friends or people in my circle who we all have our own intelligences, and they had an easier time shifting into that. I used to be so envious or tortured by what they seemingly were able to do while I was grappling with it. I think that it changes the more we recover and the more we do something, right? We're carving out new pathways. So the more I was around people from the opposite sex/gender, the more I hugged my friends. The more I started, I guess they call hooking up. The more I did it, the more it sort of, organized itself. I don't think it ever quite dissipates completely, or it hasn't yet for me, but 90%, which I think it's huge to say. I think I take so much for granted of what it's like to wake up this morning and what it took to get here. Being natural, and so many things weren't at one point. I got over the guilt and the shame in terms of religion before the physicality stuff. But things felt awkward and weird. And like I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm doing it wrong. Other people do it better. And all of that stuff took a very, very, very long time. A lot of failed relationships, a lot of mistakes, a lot of shame, a lot of many other things. And eventually, over time, when I look back, through many interactions, through much therapy, I don't spend a lot of energy there anymore. I just am,
Yes.
I don't know if that resonates, but I take it for granted. I'm glad that we're talking about this, and I'm reminded the torturous journey it took. There's always sort of a tug of war between something I want really badly, but feels off, or weird or dangerous. But once I felt more okay in myself too, it stopped feeling like that. We're talking in riddles over here a little bit, but I think that what I want to come away from this is that everything that we're talking about, it feels like you're walking around in clown shoes for decades. It does not feel the way you read about it on a Facebook post. It does not feel the way it looks when you're reading the book, Leaving the Fold. That is maybe a textbook, but real life, it's even the most arranged real life doesn't feel like that, but Leaving the Fold, we got to normalize the chaos of it, and how you're merely able to organize a little later on.
Yeah.
When something starts to build. But as you're doing it, if it feels weird, if all of these things that I talked about are coming up, I need you to know that, not to minimize how bad it is, but that it's not abnormal. Things are happening the way they're supposed to, quote unquote. It's not pleasant, but there's nothing off about you.
That's
specifically.
right. Yeah. Yes, that's right. I just really encourage former fundamentalists of every stripe, if we can do our best to exchange judgment for curiosity. So swap out the judgment and just give ourselves permission, allow ourselves to be curious. And that absolutely expands our world, whereas the judgmental aspects, that really contracts our world and makes it so much smaller. So giving ourselves a permission to explore what it's like to be a sexual being, to actually enjoy being touched or touching myself, just experiencing those sensations without judgment. So there were so many things, you used the word hijacked, so many aspects of our personhood that were hijacked by the religion of our parents, who of course were not trying to harm us. They were doing what they thought was right. But now we're left to pick up the pieces and rebuild ourselves. And so that's why I'm hosting the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference. We'll have people talking about things as basic as what it's like to start dating when you've been raised, with severe sexual repression, basically, and then suddenly you're kind of thrown into the arena of secular dating, and people are sending naked pictures, and you're not even sure how to approach other people or talk to a male or female person. Those kind of things can feel overwhelming. So I want people to get used to thinking about them, talking about them. We can feel validated when we hear other people sharing their experiences, and they're accepting of our experiences and our struggles. So that's just one of the things that'll be addressed at the conference. But I sure hope that we have a great attendance, because I think it's going to be really helpful for a lot of people.
Agreed. Well said, Janice. Well said. It's so hard to do those things, right? Not judge ourselves. We're trying to enact or incorporate narratives that are the polar opposite of what was drilled into us. Judge every sensation you're having. And it's going to take more than a New York minute to have that thing move, and which makes it even more important to be on our own side. Yeah, I think that the rest of it will be messy, kind of forever. But there is one thing that we can come back to, and it's going to feel weird. Being on our side, learning how to trust ourselves, that what you're feeling, thinking, and sensing. Other people don't get to say what it means, and so on and so forth. It's coming back home it sounds very spiritual and mystical, but I don't know how else to say it. It's not being at war, not spending so much energy like being in the battlefield inside. It doesn't take a day. It's kind of chipped away at and urged forever. No matter how far you go, you get away from it. You can always come back to being on your side, at least in your dialogue inside. It won't always look pretty. Maybe you won't be able behaviorally to do the right things, but you can talk to yourself a certain way. And I think that is the ultimate freedom, the kind of dominant voice in your head. The narrator, that was probably the biggest freedom, is gaining back authorship of the narrator.
Oh, yeah.
The person who makes sense of things, the person who describes them, the person who says whether they apply or whether they don't, sort of that inside out thing, realizing what's not my voice, realizing what is mine. Doesn't take a day. And there's no guarantee either, but I think that we're all worth it, to at least give it a fair try.
Yes. What I hear from you is a lot of self-compassion and self-acceptance as being important parts of our healing when we're coming from religion. Oh, this has just been such a pleasure chatting with you, Pesach. Is there a way for people to get in touch with you, either on social media or just any way people could reach out to you?
Yeah. I don't have... I think that takes time to create. So I see myself as like, if I make it later in life to put out something more comprehensive, because I'm still developing myself. But you can find me on social media, and Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, the whole shmebang. I'm probably the only person with this name in the universe. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Well, we'll make sure we have some links in the show notes. And thanks again for spending time with me today. It was a real pleasure. I hope our paths continue to cross, and I'm looking forward to you speaking next year at the conference on religious trauma. Thanks again.
Likewise, Janice. Thank you for all that you do. Talk to you soon. Bye.